Hello and welcome everyone to Ananta's Arohana podcasts. Today we are joined by Vrinda Kapoor, co-founder of Third Eye Tech. This past September, Third Eye Tech, Bharat Semi entered into a strategic technology partnership with the United States Space Force to set up a semiconductor fabrication plant in India. This plant will manufacture chips for advanced sensing, for communication, and power electronics for our national security purposes. It's a watershed arrangements, and it's a first on two scores. It's the world's first multi-chip plant, and for India, it's the first military chip plant, period. So let's start at the beginning, Vrinda. How did this deal come about? What channels of the Indian and American governments made this happen? Can you walk us through it?
Thanks, Prerna, for having me here, and really excited for this conversation. So we started working with U.S. government back in 2019, right? So before any of these framework agreements happened, and we were trying to figure out what is the best way to work together. And what we realized is that any real partnership emerges when there's a win-win on both sides. I think the one thing that we do wrong as Indian businesses, we don't leverage our strengths enough. Um, we have the largest semiconductor talent base in the world, right? It's an aging workforce in the West, writ large, not just in the US. So when you bring that conversation to the forefront, you immediately get better responsiveness from the other side. Things really took off when the iCET initiative took shape. So the foundational agreements took us about 3.5 years to get signed. And then iCET happened. And then everything else happened at warp speed after that. Right. So the reason I think iCET was so immensely successful is because of the leadership level oversight. Right. When two leaders come together and they implore their governments to work together in an expeditious manner. And I believe I'm quoting from some of the joint releases that have happened over the last year and a half. I think we see that translate into outcomes on the ground. The second thing, I think that India is now at an inflection point where corporate dynamism is becoming a real thing. Younger companies are extremely dynamic, are extremely hungry, and are willing to do things that the old guard normally shies away from. So I think a confluence of those two things and the Narendra Modi government's push towards making India a technology powerhouse, right? All of the incentives that they've laid out on the ground. When those forces come together, you see these kind of outcomes happen.
That's to the strategic and bureaucratic evolution in both countries that's clearly led to this. Can we also talk about another form of evolution, which is you have said before that India has always been a consumer of defense products and defense technology. With this deal, though, India is taking a step towards becoming a producer. Can we speak to that evolution?
I think that's also a window into the evolution of India as a country, right? So if we think about where we were 20 years ago, where we are today, and where we hope to grow by 2047, which is the targets that we have to become a developed nation with a $30 trillion economy, what is the tipping point? So the last 20 years have seen India grow massive services business, downside of which is that, it's a very low margin labor arbitrage. We do a lot of the low end of manufacturing, which again, we end up with very low revenue per employee that we have. And all of the startups that we've seen in India so far are tech enabled, not tech developers. Right, that's where we are right now. Where we need to get to is where we have Indian tech companies that can compete at the global stage. So just an interesting statistic over here, the top 10 US tech companies, which were startups 20 years ago, right, have a market cap equivalent to the GDP of Germany. It's a staggering statistic, it's a staggering number. But that's really how we need to start thinking about it. And I see that policy is the biggest lever in creating that market. So when you saw the Narendra Modi government come in the second time, there were two advantages that we had. The first was that we saw political continuity. And it's not just political continuity of the last administration, but it was political continuity to build on everything good that the administration before that had done. Right? Aadhaar being a classic example of that. That was the first. The second was much bolder industrial policy. And the third was a much larger risk appetite. That's where we started. Now, what we are working on as a company, I believe, is a window into a changing country. There will be others that will emerge over the next decade with similar trajectories in different arenas. We're already seeing the foundation stones of that. You're starting to see energy transformation becoming front and central to industrial policy. You're starting to see startups compete in that space. One of the largest battery plants in the country is set up by an erstwhile startup. So we're starting to see that shift and that change happen. I think it's about creating enough backing from the government and enough reduction of bureaucracy so that we can push through into developing Indian product companies.
Speaking of that, the larger swath of technology policies and the industrial transformation that's taken place, national security itself is a wide blanket now. It cuts across many sectors, many industrial bases. From an Indian perspective, what are the subsectors that need an immediate public private push? Which are the ones that have seen growth already? What are the next frontiers? What are the major risks?
So I think government has done a really good job of summarizing their missions, right? So we have a semiconductor mission, we have an AI mission, and we have a quantum mission. And that's going to touch five anchor industries that they're looking to create: clean energy, defense, electronics, biotech, right? And then the entire India technology stack writ large, which includes, the government to citizen bridge. So if we were to look at that as the anchor of how the government is thinking about building out India over the next 20 years, right, we get an insight into what those levers are and where we have additional levers as industry. As far as frontier technologies are concerned, I think it's going to be the application of frontier technologies that is going to be able to impact our country and its growth. The one disagreement that I have with a lot of the narrative that goes on in the public space is that let's take the example of AI. Right? There is a view in parts of our country that India needs to focus on applications and not on technology, which fundamentally means let's not focus on building LLMs, let's not focus on building GPUs. Let's work on creating the market for those opportunities. And I believe that will be another missed opportunity. We need to do both. The venture capital industry does a fantastic job of funding the end applications. The government needs to double down on funding of technology. Because otherwise, we're going to end up 20 years later in the exact same conversation where we are exporting wheat and we are importing bread.
That's a fascinating overview. Let's pull focus back to the deal we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, which is the semiconductor fabrication plant that you will be building alongside partners. It's the first of a kind plant. We've mentioned that. What does it mean when you build something that's first of a kind? The supply does it have to be built from scratch? From minerals to parts, the quantum of requirements that you have from both procurement and design perspectives is quite large. So, where are these individual things sourced from right now? Is there any part of this supply chain that's indigenous? If not, is there a way to make it indigenous and secure?
It the supply chain is a 10-year strategy. Even as a business, my first 3 years are going to go in construction and bring up off the plant. My next 2 years are going to go into stabilization of my market cap. And it's only after that that I'll shift my focus to supply chain. Right? That's typically as a business how I will think. I would believe that the government needs to be just 2 years ahead of that. So, from the government of India's perspective, do we have the first couple of semiconductor plants approved and ready to start construction? Once they are, our first low hanging fruit is that we need to make sure that once they are ready, the equipment commissioning can be done easily. So, do we have the manpower for that? The third is once it starts, what are the items that are required for daily replacement? Gases. Do we have an ecosystem that can supply those gases? Do we have a requirements list? And then after that, we would get into minerals and other parts of the supply chain. I'm not discounting that minerals are probably front and central of this of any kind of materials effort, but I'm saying that we as India need to bite off this entire thing in chunks, right? If we start to think about everything that we need to accomplish in the next 10 years and we do it in an ad hoc way, we're not going to get anywhere. What we need to do is a very targeted, focused approach, something that as a country we are not particularly good at, but it's something that we will need to relearn.
Can we focus on the set chunks though? Like what are outside of minerals? There's a procurement system. You'll You've talked about the larger ecosystem existing and how there will be multiple partners required down the value chain. What does that imply? How do you aggregate this demand across the value chain? Can you paint a picture of where the market currently is, where it needs to go? What kind of partners and what, again, these chunks that you need? How do you even start attacking this problem?
You start attacking this problem one step at a time. So, like I said, for me, next year, I need to make sure that my contractor is in place, somebody who's built this kind of a facility before. I need to make sure that I have senior leadership in my company that has actioned something like this before, which necessarily means they won't be Indian. I need to figure out a method of knowledge transfer so that my team over here is able to absorb best practices and know how from the foreign team as well as from the technology transfer partners. And I also need to make sure that I have a visibility on the equipment that I need and what the lead times are. After that, I would go to the next phase of it, right? Making sure that I have my people on the ground trained to absorb that equipment and make it operational. And then I would shift to the individual aspects of the supply chain to make sure that my low hanging fruit is plugged first and then go from there down the value chain. The last thing that I need to work on a local supply chain or indigenization for is probably the item that will give me the largest boost on my P&L in the years to come. But we can save that for slightly down the line. What we need to work on now is immediate requirements to become functional and operational.
That's interesting. The current deal that we're talking about is with the US. So it goes to say that a fair few of your partners across this value chain that you described would be American. What are the other key diplomatic relationships that you as a company and India as a country need to focus on as we build this defense technology future? Semiconductors is just one part of that future. So where do you see the larger geopolitical map that way?
So I think that technology diplomacy is something that India needs to rethink, right? Because technology diplomacy effectively has to have an industrial aspect to that policy. And I think that, we think of it too much at the government to government level, right? Whereas if you look at whether it's the US, whether it's Japan, whether it's Australia, it's business to business with an edifice of government, right? So that's the first thing. We need to change the prism of how we think. And as far as actually getting into, multilateral diplomatic engagements, the US, of course, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. I think these need to be the 4 areas of focused outreach. We also need to work more on the European equation writ large. Right? There is a massive trust deficit at the diplomatic level. Maybe not at the diplomatic level, but at what trickles down to business between Europe and India. And it's something that we need to work on addressing.
That's fascinating. I'd ask a concluding question because we have you for a limited time. Where do we go from here? You've spoken about it can't just be a government to government problem. We can't rely on older habits here. How does that actually come to fruition? What's a public private partnership like? iCET is one thing that you've talked about. Can we talk a little bit more about iCET like structures? How do they even come about? Where do you see us pulling focus in the next year to make this happen for you in industry?
I think we need to use key diplomatic setups to further industry to industry collaboration. So I think we need to first take a step back. We need to go back to Government of India and ask them from their industrial policy perspective, what are the key areas and who are the key players? And then we need to roundtable with those key area with the players in each of those subset of key areas and understand what their asks for partnerships are and then curate them, right? Track twos are a phenomenal way to be able to do that, right? Just put a bunch of people in a room with from a very targeted industry for very targeted outcomes. You see, the US does a fantastic job of leveraging this, right? Munich Security Conference is a great example. All big American tech is there with the NSA and with the Secretary of State. They're all there getting their way, getting those meetings set up for them with the relevant partners in the foreign governments or in the foreign companies. We have to do more to leverage these platforms. We have fantastic platforms that are of our own. We have the US Forum that Ananta runs. We have Raisena. We have events which have convening power. We also participate in events that have convening power. We need to do a better job of making sure that the right industry meets the right player on the other side. Historically, this is something that government of India has shied away from, right? They're neutral. It's a facade of neutrality that has to be projected, but we're harming our own interests in doing that. A simple example was the US government had some key engagements that were coming up in Delhi a couple of weeks ago, and they had brought industry with them. Not for the actual engagements, but to use that as a reason to set up key meetings for them. And the embassy takes point on setting up those meetings. So we need to create better structures between business, our track twos, our think tanks, and government. And we need to create better synergy there.
Last question, and we'll be a little specific in this one. What kind of semiconductors is this fab going to make that you're working on? We know that traditional semiconductors use one material. I think you're going to use compound, but can you talk about the specifics of what you're going to build?
So effectively, what we're setting up is in the fab is a 3-5 platform. So compound semiconductors basically means two materials come together. We're looking at elements of group 3 and group 5 of the periodic table. So indium, gallium, arsenide, parts of silicon, carbide. Those are the materials that we're really going to focus on. Our imperative is to do three things. One is night vision. Then that means everything from military night vision to CCTV night vision. It means the entire spectrum of it. The second part of it is communication, right? So the technology is gallium nitride on silicon carbide, and it's used for everything from our 5G base stations to FR3 to military radars, right? It covers the entire, it's the building block of that entire part of it. And then the third is silicon carbide, which is effectively crucial to energy transition in any form, right? It goes into your data centers, it goes into EVs, it goes into anything that you name.
That's interesting. So as far as the larger market cap goes, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, I think 80% of the world's semiconductors are silicon based, but 20% of those are compound. With the quantum of production that you're targeting, do those percentages change?
No, right? Because compound semiconductors there is one major difference between silicon and compound, which is in scale manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Silicon is easier to manufacture at scale. It's more complicated to design, but it's easier to manufacture at scale. Now, silicon has its own limitations as a material. That's the wedge that compound semiconductors have found. And in the last 25 years, compound semiconductors, what we call wide bandgap materials, have seen innovation in material science like never before. Right? So we're going to see an increase in compound semiconductors as an overall percentage of the total semiconductor market in the world. And I believe that at some point the steady state is going to come to about 40 to 45% over the next decade. So that's a huge growth in the market. A lot of this is going to be driven by the better manufacturability of compound semiconductors so that, the EV market and others can start to roll that out at a larger scale. For us, the size of our facility will make it one of the largest in the world right now, right? There are only 2 or 3 larger compound semiconductor facilities than what we have planned. And obviously, the idea would be to get it stable and then grow.
From your mouth to God's ears. Thank you. To conclude, in terms of the market understanding, who's the global leader in manufacturing compound semiconductors? Where does India rank right now? Where are we taking it?
So global leader is interesting. Taiwan has a huge amount of market share. However, most of the larger manufacturing currently exists in the US, with Italy gaining a lot of momentum in the background.
And where does India come into the picture?
I'm sorry, I forgot one thing. China. China is the single largest manufacturer of compound semiconductors in the world today. We have a blank slate. We have nothing today, right? But we also have incredible will to make this happen. So I think that 10 years later, the India story will be very different.
Well, we look forward to that growth. And thank you so much for actually contributing to making India appear on that slate, which is currently blank. Thanks, Vrinda. We appreciate your time. And thank you, everyone, for listening in.